In the lexicon of my family, I was always defined by what I was not. I was not vivacious like Chloe. I was not visionary like my father. I was not socially magnetic like my mother. My name is Elena, and for 36 years, I have been the family's background noise, constant, reliable, and completely ignored. I am a civil engineer. To most people, that sounds like a career. To my parents, Richard and Nancy, it sounded like a surrender. They viewed my fascination with load-bearing capacities and hydrodynamics as a sign of a small mind. They preferred the grand gestures, the gala invitations, the ribbon cuttings, the surface-level shine of high society. My sister Chloe, 5 years my junior, was the masterpiece they had always wanted. She didn't have a career, she had projects. She didn't have a budget, she had visions. Growing up, the house was a shrine to her existence. Her dance trophies occupied the center of the mantle, while my academic awards for mathematics were used as coasters in the den. I remember a specific moment when I was 12, showing my father a bridge model I had built from balsa wood. He glanced at it for 2 seconds before turning to watch Chloe perform a clumsy pirouette. "That's nice, Elena," he had said, his eyes never leaving the star. "Try to be more like your sister. She has flair." That was the day I realized that in this family, the load-bearing wall is never thanked for holding up the roof, it is only cursed when it gets in the way of a new window. I spent a decade building a wall around my own life. I worked 80-hour weeks at the county planning department. While my peers were buying sports cars or going on European vacations, I lived in a studio apartment that smelled like old blueprints and cheap coffee. I was saving for a singular goal, a place where no one could tell me I was boring. 3 years ago, I found it. It was a 1,200-square-foot mid-century cottage perched on the crest of the valley. It was a modest structure, but it was geologically perfect. It sat on a shelf of solid granite, anchored into the earth with the kind of permanence I had never felt in my parents' home. The crown jewel of the property was the porch. From that height, I could see the entire valley, the winding river, the patchwork of the forest, and the lights of the town that looked like fallen stars at night. It was my sanctuary. For the first time, I had a view that belonged to me. I didn't invite my family for a year. I knew what they would say. They would call it small, quaint, or a starter home. But eventually, the guilt of the invisible daughter won out, and I invited them for dinner. The reaction was exactly as I feared. My mother spent the evening pointing out that the kitchen was efficient, her word for tiny, and my father spent the time checking his watch. Chloe, however, didn't look at the house. She stood on my porch, staring down at the 10-acre slope directly beneath my property. "It's a shame," she had whispered, her eyes narrowed. "All this beauty, and you're the only one who gets to see it." 6 months later, at the dreaded Sunday roast, the trap was sprung. My mother had used the grand china, the set reserved for moments of family triumph. "We have news," my father announced, his voice booming with the authority of a man who has never been told no. "Chloe has decided it's time to settle down. And since the land below your ridge has just been sitting there as woods, Nancy and I have decided to gift it to her for her wedding present." Chloe smiled at me. It wasn't a smile of sisterly affection, it was a smile of conquest. "I've hired Marcus Thorne, Elena. We're building a glass pavilion. 3 stories, cantilever decks, the works. It's going to be the talk of the county." I felt the blood drain from my face. I knew that slope. I had reviewed the geological surveys for that entire sector just months prior. "Dad, Mom," I said, my voice carefully controlled. "You can't build there. That's a Class 4 unstable slope. The soil is mostly expansive clay over a high water table. If you put a 3-story structure there, the weight will cause the soil to creep toward the valley floor. Not to mention, a house of that size will completely block my view. It will be like living behind a billboard." My mother sighed, the sound of a woman dealing with a petulant child. "Elena, don't be so dramatic. Chloe just wants a beautiful home. Is it so much to ask for you to be happy for her for once? Why must you always make everything about soil and drainage? Because the laws of physics don't care about your feelings, Mom, I replied. My father slammed his hand on the table. Enough. Marcus Thorne is a professional. He's built half the mansions in this town. You're just a reviewer, Elena. You sit in a cubicle and push papers. Don't presume to tell a man like Marcus how to do his job. The project moves forward. Construction began in April. Within weeks, the quiet of my sanctuary was shattered by the roar of diesel engines and the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of pile drivers, except they weren't driving deep enough. I watched from my porch every evening. I saw the silt fences fail. I saw the runoff from the construction site begin to erode the base of the ridge. I saw the retaining wall they were building. In engineering, there is a massive difference between a gravity wall and a reinforced cantilever wall. A gravity wall relies on its own weight to hold back the earth. On a slope like that, a gravity wall is a death sentence. It needs deep steel pilings driven into the bedrock, the granite shelf my own house sat on, to prevent the entire mass from sliding. Marcus Thorne, the polished contractor, was cutting corners. Piling is expensive. It's invisible work that adds no aesthetic value to a house. He was spending the money on Italian marble and floor-to-ceiling glass instead. I sent him an official notice from the county. Subject: violation of site drainage and structural integrity standards. He replied with a phone call to my boss. My boss, a man nearing retirement who didn't want any trouble with the pillars of the community, called me into his office. Elena, I know you're thorough, he said, looking anywhere but at my eyes. But Marcus Thorne has a reputation. Your sister's house is a high-profile project. Let's not get bogged down in technicalities regarding the slope. Just let it go. That was the moment I realized that being the boring one meant people thought I was also weak. They assumed that because I followed the rules, I wouldn't know how to use those same rules as a scalpel. The glass box rose quickly. It was a monstrosity of ego. 3 levels of glass and steel that sat directly in front of my porch. My view of the valley was gone, replaced by the sight of Chloe's walk-in closet and her meditation room. I was living in a literal shadow. Then, the October rains arrived. It wasn't a normal autumn rain. It was a 100-year event. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum and stayed that way for 10 days. In my office, I watched the groundwater sensors. The pore water pressure, the pressure of water trapped between soil particles, was skyrocketing. When soil becomes saturated, it loses its shear strength. It stops behaving like a solid and starts behaving like a liquid. On the 8th day of the storm, I received an urgent emergency permit request on my desk. It was from Marcus Thorne. The retaining wall was shifting. He could see the cracks forming in the driveway. He wanted permission to pour an additional 40 tons of concrete at the base of the wall to weight it down. He thought more weight would solve the problem. In reality, adding 40 tons to a sliding mass is like putting a lead weight on a sled. It doesn't stop the slide, it accelerates the momentum. I looked at the permit. I looked at the falsified soil reports Marcus had submitted 6 months prior, reports that claimed the slope was stable rocky loam when it was actually saturated clay. I didn't sign the permit. I didn't deny it either. I sat in my office and I waited. I waited until 4 p.m. on Friday, the day before Chloe's grand housewarming gala. The clock on my office wall ticked with a rhythmic, mechanical finality. Outside, the rain lashed against the glass, blurring the world into a gray smudge of water and concrete. Marcus Thorne's permit lay on my desk, a white flag disguised as a request. He was desperate. He knew the laws of physics were closing in on him, and he expected me, the reliable, boring Elena, to provide him with a legal umbrella. But I didn't reach for my stamp. Instead, I opened the county's digital archives. I pulled up every file related to the Thorne Development Group from the last 5 years. I looked for the patterns. I found them in the margins of soil density tests and the footnotes of environmental impact statements. Marcus had a signature move. He would submit preliminary reports as final ones, betting that the workload at the county was too high for anyone to check the difference. He had bet his entire career on my fatigue. I spent the next 6 hours drafting a notice of immediate hazard and order to vacate. This wasn't a standard rejection. This was an administrative tactical strike. I cited Statute 44B, which governs hydrostatic pressure risks to adjacent properties. I detailed how his failure to drive pilings into the granite shelf, the very shelf my house sat on, had created a liquefaction corridor that threatened the structural integrity of the entire ridge. I didn't just deny his 40-ton concrete fix. I declared the entire site a red zone. I hit send to the county sheriff's office and the building inspector's emergency line at exactly 4:59 p.m. Then, I turned off my computer, packed my bag, and drove home in the dark. The morning of the gala, the rain finally stopped, leaving behind a world that felt fragile and sodden. The air smelled of wet earth and impending disaster. From my porch, I couldn't see the valley, but I could hear the house below me. It was a subtle sound, the groan of steel under tension, the tiny ping of glass adjusting to a shifting foundation. At 2 p.m., the catering trucks arrived. I watched from my shadow as workers unloaded crates of champagne and silver platters. At 4 p.m., the string quartet began to tune their instruments. The sound of a cello drifted up the hill, beautiful and haunting, like a dirge for a building that didn't know it was already dead. I didn't get dressed in a gown. I put on my most severe professional blazer, my heavy-duty work boots, and a pair of spectacles I usually only wore for deep data review. I looked like the paper pusher they all despised. I walked down the steep path that connected our properties. The mud was slick, the ground beneath my feet feeling like it wanted to move, to breathe, to slide. As I approached the glass box, the sheer scale of the arrogance was breathtaking. It was a monument to the idea that money can override gravity. My mother was at the entrance, wearing a dress that cost more than my first car. "Elena," she chirped, though her eyes were already scanning the crowd for more important guests. "You're early. And you're dressed for a construction site. Go inside and change, dear. Chloe has a spare wrap you can wear so you don't look so drab." "I'm not here to celebrate, Mom," I said. "Where is Marcus?" "I found them in the grand room." It was a cavern of glass, 3 stories high, cantilevered over the very slope that was currently trying to swallow it. Chloe was standing by a fireplace that was purely decorative, holding a glass of amber liquid. She looked like a queen surveying her kingdom. "Elena," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Did you come down to finally see what a real view looks like?" I didn't answer. I walked to the center of the room, my boots clunking loudly on the imported marble. I placed the gray clasp envelope on a glass coffee table. The sound was like a gunshot. Marcus Thorne stepped out from the shadows of the bar, his face tight. "Elena. I didn't see a signature on that emergency permit this morning." "That's because I didn't sign it, Marcus," I said. I projected my voice, using the tone I used when testifying in court. I filed a cease and desist and an immediate evacuation order. As of 4 p.m. today, 2 hours ago, this structure is legally a collapsed hazard. No one is permitted to be inside. The room went into a practiced quiet. The string quartet stopped mid-note. My father pushed through the crowd, his face a mask of fury. "Elena, what is this nonsense? This is your sister's night. You are humiliated because we built something better than your little shack? This is a personal vendetta." "It's not personal, Dad. It's mathematical," I replied, pulling a printed graph from the envelope. "Look at the poor water pressure sensors. The slope has reached its saturation limit. The retaining wall is currently leaning 3 degrees toward the valley. By morning, it will be 5. By tomorrow night, the glass box will be a glass slide dot." "You're lying," Chloe hissed, her glass shaking in her hand. You're just trying to ruin this for me. I'm an officer of the county, Chloe. If you don't evacuate this building now, the sheriff, who is currently in the driveway, will remove everyone by force. As if on cue, a low, guttural rumble shook the floor. It wasn't an earthquake, it was the sound of the earth's patience running out. A tiny, spider-web crack appeared in the marble floor beneath our feet, snaking its way toward the massive glass windows. Panic is a funny thing. It starts as a whisper and ends as a stampede. Out! Marcus Thorne suddenly shouted, his professional polish disappearing. Everyone out. Now. The next 20 minutes were a blur of screaming, spilled champagne, and the frantic rustle of expensive silk. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room as the crowd surged past me. I watched my parents, Richard and Nancy, being ushered out by the very security team they had hired to keep unimportant people away. Chloe stayed until the end, staring at the crack in the floor. You did this, she whispered to me. You killed my dream. No, Chloe, I said, looking her in the eye. Gravity killed your dream. I just gave you the paperwork for the funeral. I walked out the front door just as the sheriff's deputies began stringing yellow caution tape across the driveway. I walked back up my path, back to my small, boring cottage on the granite shelf. I sat on my porch in the dark. The rain started again, a soft patter against the roof. Below me, I could hear the heavy machinery of the county, not to build, but to secure. Around 2 a.m., there was a sound I will never forget. It wasn't a crash, it was a sigh. A massive, wet, tearing sound as the retaining wall finally gave way. The glass box didn't shatter all at once. It folded. It slid down the slope in a slow-motion dance of steel and vanity, ending as a heap of glitter in the valley below. The next morning, the view was back. The slope was a scar of brown mud and broken glass, but the horizon was clear. The river was winding, the forest was green, and the valley was mine again. My father called me a week later. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't apologize for the 20 years of boring comments. The insurance won't pay, Elena, he said, his voice sounding old and hollow. They're citing gross negligence based on your county reports. Chloe has lost everything. We had to take out a second mortgage to cover the demolition of the debris. Are you satisfied? I looked at the granite beneath my feet. I looked at the sun hitting the river. I'm safe, Dad, I said. And for the first time in my life, I don't have to worry about the foundation cracking. Because I'm the one who checked it. I hung up. I made a cup of tea. I sat on my porch. And I watched the view. The days following the collapse were not filled with the dramatic flair of a courtroom drama, they were filled with the tedious, grinding reality of a disaster zone. My ridge, once a place of quiet contemplation, was now a buzzing hive of orange vests and yellow tape. I stood on the edge of my property line, looking down at the void where the glass box had once stood. It looked like a giant had stepped on a crystal chandelier. The cantilever decks, which Chloe had bragged about during that final dinner, were now twisted rebar fingers clawing at the sky. The county had appointed a lead forensic geologist to investigate. His name was Dr. Arrogance, a man who spoke in the same rhythmic, factual cadence that I did. We stood together at the scarp, the point where the earth had literally torn away from the hillside. You called it, Elena, he said, tapping his clipboard against his thigh. The hydrostatic pressure behind that gravity wall was astronomical. It's like they tried to hold back a tidal wave with a picket fence. They didn't want to hear about the water, I said, my voice flat. They wanted to hear about the Italian marble. Well, Arrogance sighed, looking at the wreckage. They'll be hearing about the water for the next 5 years in court. The silt runoff has contaminated the creek bed 3 miles down. The EPA is going to have a field day with your sister's dream. I felt a strange lack of triumph. It wasn't joy, it was the cold satisfaction of a math problem that had finally reached its inevitable solution. The variable of arrogance had been subtracted, and the result was 0. 2 weeks later, the summons came. Not from the court, but from my mother. Dinner at 6 o'clock. Mandatory, the text read. No emojis. No love, Mom. Just a command. I arrived at my parents' house, the shrine to Chloe, feeling like a foreign diplomat entering hostile territory. The hallway was still lined with her photos, but they felt different now. The girl in the frames, the one with the catalog smile and the effortless grace, was gone. In her place was a woman who was currently hiding in the guest wing, refusing to see the sun. My father was sitting in his leather wingback chair, a glass of scotch in his hand. He looked 10 years older. The pillar of the community was crumbling from the inside. Sit down, Elena, he said, not looking up. I sat. The silence was thick, heavy with the scent of wood smoke and resentment. My mother entered from the kitchen, carrying a tray of tea that she set down with enough force to make the porcelain rattle. We've seen the reports, she began, her voice trembling with a controlled rage. The insurance company, our insurance company, which helped fund the land purchase, has denied every single claim. They cited willful disregard of engineering standards and falsified geological documentation. And they cited you, Elena. Page after page of your memos, your emails, your warnings. I warned you for a year, Mom, I said. I warned Marcus. I warned the county. You didn't warn us, she snapped. You attacked us. You waited until the most public moment possible to humiliate your sister. You could have come to us privately. You could have signed that permit and fixed it later. You can't fix a landslide after it happens, Mom, I said, leaning forward. And I did come to you. At the Sunday dinner. In emails. In letters you never opened because they didn't have a luxury brand logo on the envelope. I was the boring one, remember? The one who didn't know anything about Flair. My father finally looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot. The bank is calling in the construction loan, Elena. Because the collateral, the house, is currently a pile of trash in a ravine, they want the full balance. $500,000. We're going to have to sell this house. Your childhood home. He waited for the guilt to hit me. He waited for the convenient daughter to burst into tears and offer her savings. That's a tragedy, Dad, I said, and I meant it. But it was a choice. You chose to trust a man who lied over a daughter who studied. You chose to value Chloe's vision over my reality. This house isn't being lost because of my paperwork. It's being lost because of your pride. The room went cold. My mother recoiled as if I had slapped her. You're a monster, she whispered. A cold, calculating monster. No, I stood up, smoothing my blazer. I'm an engineer. When a bridge is unsafe, I close it. When a building is a hazard, I condemn it. I don't do it to be mean. I do it so people don't die. You're upset because I stopped the play before the final act, but if I hadn't, that house would have collapsed with 300 people inside. Would you be happier if you were planning 300 funerals instead of one bankruptcy? I didn't wait for an answer. I walked out of the house I grew up in, knowing I would probably never be invited back. I drove back to my ridge. The road was quiet, the air crisp with the scent of pine. I walked onto my porch and sat in my old wooden rocker. Below me, the scar on the hillside was being reclaimed by the earth. The county had mandated a regreening project. Soon, the mud would be covered in clover and ryegrass. In 5 years, you wouldn't even know a glass box had ever existed. I looked out at the valley. The river was a silver thread winding through the trees. The lights of the town began to twinkle, one by one. I realized then that my parents were right about one thing: I was a load-bearing wall. But they forgot that a load-bearing wall doesn't just hold things up, it defines the space. It decides what stands and what falls. I picked up my phone and saw a notification. A friend from the office had sent me a link to a new job opening, head of forensic engineering for the state. I smiled. It was a boring job. Lots of paperwork. Lots of rules. Lots of fine print. It was perfect. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and listened to the silence of the valley. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. Dignity isn't found in the glass you display or the flair you project. It's found in the granite beneath your feet and the honesty of your own work. The world is full of Chloes, people who want the view without the foundation. But the world is run by the Elenas. And every once in a while, the Elenas decide to stop holding up the roof.